Dr. Robbin Shoemaker, National Program Leader for Economics in the Institute of Food Production and Sustainability at the USDA's National Institute of Food and Agriculture in Washington, D.C. Dr. Shoemaker earned his doctorate at Georgetown University. Prior to completing his education, Dr. Shoemaker earned a living as a meat cutter in local butcher shops and small packing plants. As such, he is all too familiar with the rigors experienced by our meat processing employees. Dr. Shoemaker, we thank you for taking the time away from the government and speaking with us here today. Please share your screen with the audience.
Dr. Shoemaker, we can see your screen. Are you unmuted? The unmute button will now be in the top of your screen in the orange bar.
Okay, are we there?
Yes, you are ready.
Okay, all right. Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I did have experience in the meat industry and the packing plants, and I have the utmost empathy for the people that had to go through this through the pandemic. So I just want to make that point starting out. So I will. Why is this not advancing? Okay. So I want to talk a little bit how NIFA has responded to the pandemic, provide a brief overview of some of the projects we've supported, and then look ahead at some of the issues that we see as at this point, and then provide some indication of the type of support we have for these programs. So first of all, what is NIFA? NIFA is the National Institute for Food and Agriculture. It's the USDA extramural research agency. The intramural include the Agriculture Research Service and the Economic Research Service, which was where I came from at one point. We fund competitive and capacity programs, supporting both research, education, and extension activities. Primarily supports the land-grant universities, but also the 1890s minority-serving students and others. For fiscal 21, there's about, our budget's around 1.7 billion, which is up, and some of that includes additional funding we've received to support work around COVID-19. So, you know, people spoke, and NIFA responded and developed a new program, a rapid response program in response to the outbreak, as well as mobilized and utilized some of the existing programs we have. We tried to be as fronting as possible, providing vehicles for people to ask questions about what's available, what are the vehicles we have to fund research, and try to present the existing programs we have and how they could be utilized to pursue these activities. The Rapid Response Program, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute, we funded around $14 million in research projects. I think it was about a 90-day turnaround from the announcement of this program to when the checks were cut to these universities, which is a pretty good effort. The COVID, the AFRI program, which is AFRI is the Agricultural Food and Research Initiative. which came out of the 2008 Farm Bill, and that's the main competitive program in NIFA. And a specific program that was developed looked at these 4 broad topics: health and security in livestock, food and food processing, the well-being of farm, food service providers in rural America, and economic security more broadly. And when that was announced, there was apparently around 383 inquiries about that, 96 applications, and a total of 15 awards for about $14 million. These are some of the list of the projects, and I'll highlight a few more in a minute. But largely they looked at, for example, the vulnerability or susceptibility within packing facilities. I tried to begin to think about ways to accommodate some of those needs. The environmental control in food service establishments, susceptibility of ruminants to exposure to different environmental factors, and develop some diagnostic tools. What else we have? There we go. Looked at dairy industry and delivery and evaluation of resources for producers and workers, filling the gaps and looking at the data needed to impact behavior, and broadly look at food concerns of the supply chain, and I'll talk more about that as well in a bit. Some of the particular examples were translating research into practice for meat and poultry processing, and this investigated the meat and poultry processing areas and looked at areas of high risk for contamination to employees. And then in the agricultural supply chain, disruptions, costs, and strategies to enhance the resilience in the U.S. food supply. This is looked at largely beef, pork, dairy, and egg supply chains, and looked at mechanisms to try and understand where the sources of resilience would be and how they could be further exploited and augmented. Another project looked at the susceptibility of livestock to among livestock and the impact of wildlife such as deer and how they may provide transmission to livestock. I think somebody mentioned earlier the tremendous problem with the life cycle of livestock, particularly hogs. They grow at a rapid rate when the demand is not there, but the supply is. What do you do? And is there a way to try and inhibit the growth of the hogs? And that's some research that was using ammonium chloride supplements to try and manage growth. What else we have? Another program, the Education and Workforce Development Program, which is also under the AFRI umbrella. Here we developed a rapid response program to deal with social distancing primarily in education, but also in workplaces. We had about 10 million grants to deal with K to 14 formal and non-formal educational opportunities. These projects included things like 4-H at home, food experiences for agricultural science training, physically distant yet socially connected, the virtual farm, and a variety of other projects to try and facilitate the training and the ability of teachers to train through virtual and hybrid mechanisms. One project here recognizes the worker safety project, which used community health workers to try and assist and advise migrant and seasonal workers to adopt some best practices in their activities. The 4-H at home, a resource designed to meet the demand for virtual and non-virtual educational opportunities to make sure that educators and extension personnel had the ability and the vehicles to facilitate training and teaching for students. Growing math, I think that one's kind of needs an interactive digital platform for classroom-ready educational materials that teachers could use to help supplement and provide teaching materials for grades 3 through 8. Another program that we use is not a non-AFRI one, the Small Business Innovation Research grant. This is the SBIR. They devised this utilized some sort of proof of concept. It's a supportive proof of concept type of program where firms or universities can develop a project that was with this funding, it gets it tested and gets it on the ground. And here's a case where develop some biological-based fogging system to try and disinfect it, work areas. And another one using an antiviral nanotech technology to coat areas to provide protection for workers and livestock. So looking ahead, so President Biden's priorities really have an influence, a significant influence on how we think about developing research programs going forward, which is quite a change from the previous administration. But the 6 main priorities that the president has identified, obviously COVID-19, but climate change, racial equity, the economy writ large, healthcare, and immigration. And as you can imagine, a lot of these overlap, and we try to think about, as we develop our funding programs and our research agenda, how we can integrate these things as appropriate, but to the extent possible, because in many cases, for example, climate, the issues around climate change actually impact every one of these things one way or another. So we're trying to think about these things broadly. So this is, really sort of at the front of our mind as we think about developing our research programs going forward. But sort of back to the case here, we're looking at some of the issues that I think are important that we've been thinking about are relevant to this conference. Is looking at food systems broadly, looking at the role of local and regional food systems. And that, to me, that raises the question that there's a contrast between the specialization of some existing supply chains and the specialization for processor and institutional demands versus consumer and retail demands. And are there ways to adapt these systems to to be more resilient? And are local and regional systems a way to accommodate that? And I'm not so sure that's the case, but that's something we need to look at. Labor is obviously an important issue, both in terms of the supply of labor for agriculture in general. So the immigration laws and policies and regulations surrounding that have an important role to play, as well as the regulations for the how labor is utilized in the workforce. Another important area that's kind of shadows over a lot of the things we're concerned about is rural development. And here's a case where racial equity, as along the lines with the president's priorities, I think fits in as an important component. For example, heirs property is an important, a very, very important issue, particularly in the South, that has tremendous influence on the credit and financial capacity of Black farmers in rural areas where they don't have, if they don't have title to their land, there's not a whole lot they can do with that. So we really want to support some research to look along those lines. And again, that's an example where racial equity interfaces with a lot of other issues like rural development. But looking ahead, I really like Tom's comment about thinking somewhat differently about supply chains instead of sort of a linear model, which is the way we kind of usually think about these things, but more of a network approach. I think that's totally apropos. So we really need to think about just the nature of the supply chains, and what I mean. I think we really need to think hard about sort of the fundamental knowledge surrounding supply chains, so we understand the linkages within there, and have a better ability to predict the response or the effects of disasters such as the pandemics on supply chains themselves. So some of the areas that we've identified here, looking at supply chains and trying to understand the change in the length of the supply chains and what are the factors contributing to that. Measuring or developing metrics to evaluate the risk and resilience in the supply chain. I'm not sure that we've got those tools in our toolboxes yet. Again, thinking about climate change, be able to assess the role of weather and pandemics and other natural disasters and their impact on agriculture production, crop and livestock. Also looking at shipping disruptions, which can arise from a variety of sources, political, natural disasters, earthquakes, hurricanes, and other kind of things that can affect that. And how does the sector respond to those kind of disruptions? Look at the near and long-term risks associated with climate change. I think this is an interesting one. Think about the interaction between innovations and technological change and how that affects the sector and risks, supply chain risk. And also looking at sort of, I wouldn't say niche, but smaller areas such as organic foods and wine. Sometimes these don't get quite the attention, and they may have specific risks or needs or demands, or lessons that can be learned of how they might adapt to these things that might be applied in other areas. And finally, consider the impact of public policies, including agriculture, commodity policy, environmental and natural resource policy, trade policies, and other types of public policies that can have a role on different aspects of the supply chain. So looking ahead again, trying to some of the funding mechanisms we have to support this type of research. Some programs I run under the AFRI Foundational Applied Science Program are the Agriculture, Economics, and Rural Communities Program. And 3 of those are highlighted here. The Economic Markets and Trade Program, which is currently open and closes July 15th. And that, for you economists out there, that is, basically applied microeconomics, dealing with production and consumption, but is also trade and other more macro types of factors. But overall, it looks at pretty much all the factors around the supply and demand of agricultural food products. So that would be a particularly apropos place to submit proposals along the lines of the research suggested here today. The Rural Economic Development Program, which closes June 17th, that really focuses on research and extension activities beyond the farm gate. So this is really looking at the rural economy, not so much the agricultural economy, but does look at the interface between the two. But really kind of addresses the challenges that rural entrepreneurs and communities, households face in rural areas, and thinks about some of the barriers and opportunities to advance economic development in those areas. Third program, the Small Mid-Sized Farm Program, which closes June 24th. Again, that's a program that supports research and extension activities But that looks at the challenges facing small and medium-sized farms and the role they play in addressing a whole variety of issues. But it's also an area where we want to find ways to enhance the opportunities of small and mid-sized farms to be successful in the marketplace. I've listed the link at the bottom of the slide, and I hope these slides will be available to see more about these programs and these funding opportunities in particular. Also, the SBIR program is available, and they're entertaining phase one projects that were completed at phase one, but also are now in a phase two project, which is really more the advanced stage of the developing the technology or the manufacturing process. And that is closing soon on May 2nd. I've also listed the link for that. Dennis Abadabi is the program leader running that program. And finally, the SAS program, the Sustainable Ag Systems program. This was launched just a few years ago. Currently, it's about $150 million, $150 million budgeted for the program in 2021. That is already closed for this year. And this year it focused on, having been previously announced, focused on agriculture intensification, climate adaptation, development of value-added innovations, and food nutrition translation efforts. So it's a rather large program. It's really designed to support like $10 million awards that incorporate a whole variety of skills and disciplines and multidisciplinary activities to really try and move the needle on developing technologies and production innovations that address these array of issues. I don't know what the announcement will be for 2022, but I can be assured that there will be a program, and I suspect it may have even a larger budget. Let's see, that is all I have, and here are a list of links to the funding opportunities, the list of RFAs we have, a greater description of some of the programs. And I welcome comments and questions, and that's my contact at USDA. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Shoemaker. We really appreciate you sharing that information, especially with all the researchers in the that are online. Here we have some questions coming up.
All right. Does NIFA support industry academic collaborations? Yes. In fact, the AFRI programs actually, it supports research, but it doesn't preclude the non-academic applicants. So your mom can apply theoretically, but she probably won't. Well, I won't say she won't do well, but they're very competitive. So we certainly encourage, particularly some of these programs where it's really apropos that there be industry collaboration in these things. So yes, the answer is yes to that. Does NIFA have a policy research program to deal with supply chain issues? Does NIFA see a need for such? Yes, NIFA does see a need for such a program, and so some of the programs I described in there, and one of the ones I run, in fact, the Economic Markets and Trade program, is really about, it would really support the economics of supply chain research. And I think there's a lot to be learned from that. So yes, we do support that sort of thing. Does NIFA see funding consumer behavior research in the future? Yes, again, the same program, the Economic Markets and Trade. In fact, when I first began at NIFA, that market and trade, and I used it to say economics because I really wanted to broaden out the program to look at both the consumer side, the demand side, as well as the supply side. And that was a good move. We've got a lot of good research focusing on a whole variety of issues, including, labeling issues, food waste, and looking at using, nudges and behavioral economics to understand some of the consumer behavior issues. So I think that's a really important area, and yes, we definitely support that research. Anything else?
I guess another question for our broader research community is like some of the more technical research on supply chain management and that sort of thing. Is NIFA a good place to look to, or is that more NSF?
Well, I guess it depends on how, I think one of the ways we sort of distinguish ourselves from NSF is NSF, if you look at their Dear Colleague letter, they're fairly broad, fairly general, and sort of soliciting more basic research, where NIFA and USDA in general is a mission driven department, and so the work and the research that NIFA supports is much more applied in nature in general. It's mixed, obviously, but it deals more directly with applied issues. So if one wanted to submit a proposal around some of the particular mechanisms of understanding supply chain, I think that would be certainly welcome. I mean, I know I would support that. Yeah.
Okay. We don't see any other questions that we can pull up here. Thank you so much, Dr. Shoemaker, for your time and a lot of good information for us. Now I'll turn this over to my colleague, to Den.